I welcome everyone to this conversation series today. And today in the conversation, we have with us Professor Prashant Kidambi, who is Associate Professor of Colonial Urban History at the University of Leicester. After completing postgraduate degrees in history at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, he was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship to pursue a doctorate at the University of Oxford. Professor Kidambi's research explores the interface between British imperialism and the history of modern South Asia. In addition to numerous publications on the history of Bombay, he is the author of Cricket Country, the untold history of the first All India team. I have purposely kept the introductions brief today because I know we all are eager to listen to Professor Kidambi. And he actually needs very little or no introduction at all. In conversation with Professor Kidambi today, we have Professor Darshini Mahadevia, who is a well-known scholar whose research focuses on equity concerns within urban policies relating to climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and human and general development. Professor Mahadevia is presently the Professor of Social Sciences Division at and Associate Dean of Arts with Ahmedabad University. She received her doctoral degree in Urban and Regional Development from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and her research has focused on cities and the policies and processes of their development from an equity perspective. Professor Mahadevia is also looking at urban data systems, their mapping, and whether urban development dynamics are sustainable and equitable. At Ahmedabad University this year, she is teaching a course on urban finance and is part of two interdisciplinary courses, one on the city of Ahmedabad and the other on neighborhoods. I'm sure that this conversation about Mumbai or Bombay is going to be a very, very interesting one between Professor Kidambi and Professor Mahadevia today. And with that, I hand over to you, Professor Mahadevia, to please start the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. I see some friends whom I had come across for quite some time on this discussion. We were very happy that when we contacted Prashant, he said yes to this. This is the right time for us to have this conversation about a tale of two cities, Ahmedabad and Mumbai, through pandemics. Pandemics and epidemics have occurred in history periodically, and at every juncture, or there's a lesson that we learn through a pandemic or epidemic. Sometimes or a pandemic, influenza pandemic was the last one, and this one we are living through. In a sense, we are living through history. In a sense, after a decade or 2 decades, we look back and see how we passed this pandemic and what is it that happened as a consequence of it. Pandemics have always struck on first the urban areas, largely because of the living conditions of close living, high density, collective activities. I mean, that's what is defining urban. And hence, cities have dealt with these issues in the past, which is public health issues. Urban planning as a discipline begins with it's embedded in answering the issues of public health. We're going to hear the specific experience of Mumbai from Prashant of the late 19th century, early 20th century epidemics and pandemics. So Mumbai also, and like in many Indian cities, too, have been affected by plague periodically. And the 1918-19 influenza that swept across the world had also, which had killed, estimated about 20 million people globally. India also had been affected. We also have writings of Mahatma Gandhi's, in his Atmakatha, he writes how he addressed that while he was here in Ahmedabad in ashram. However, there's also other side of the story whenever this event, such major events occur. And that other side of what we call in the name of public health, because everything is fair in love and war, everything is fair in public health, and all kind of measures do get accepted by public, and often These measures also have the other side of it, of expulsions from the city and exclusions from the city. Not all cities have that experience, because we deliberately kept this as a discussion between Ahmedabad and Mumbai, Mumbai and Ahmedabad. More about Mumbai a little bit. I would speak about Ahmedabad because they are very contrasting examples of how, at least the late 19th century, early 20th century cities, these two cities handled that. Um, while we were discussing this and finalizing this event today, we started this idea with the epidemic, this pandemic starting in urban areas and trying to draw understanding from it. It has now spread to rural areas. And it has also happened in the past that plagues have spread to rural areas, because finally rural and urban are a continuum in a way. Even historically, that's been the case. The 1996 plague epidemic in London, which then spread to rural areas, the city of London got saved because then it was followed by a great London fire. And so the epidemic was controlled, but it then led to Parliament enacting a Rebuilding of London Act. And that's the beginning of what one would call interventions in the urban planning discipline. So let me, in this period, as we read across what cities are doing now contemporarily, we'll have a more discussion on it. But the example of, let's say, in Paris now, they've defined what is called a 15-minute city. That is setting up city in such a way that everything is available within 15 minutes distance. This was done to address the issue of climate change, to an effort towards climate mitigation. But in terms of COVID, also that's been useful because people don't need to travel long distances for very many daily necessities. So these are some of the innovative practices that are emerging, but we don't know what's going to happen as we move ahead. We'll have to wait and see, and maybe Prashant talk about this 5 years down the line on what has happened post this pandemic to how cities have dealt. And I'm sure different cities are going to deal with it differently depending on their local political economies, because there's not going to be the same answer all across. So let me invite Prashant to come in here and ask him to speak about the epidemic and pandemic in Mumbai in late 19th, early 20th century. What was the city's response? What were the impacts, and what was the response of the city?
Well, thank you so much, Darshini. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So thank you for the introductions, and thank you for inviting me to all the organizers. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be participating in this discussion. So let me just start with the question you asked me, Darshini, which is the impact of the plague pandemic that broke out in colonial India at the end of the 19th century. I think I want to just start off before I preface it, in a sense, by saying that when events like this, pandemics, occur, they have a huge immediate impact on the societies that they affect. But what's very interesting is that historically, if you think of the memory of these pandemics or the subsequent legacy, especially in terms of how they come to be remembered in the public consciousness, it's very odd that pandemics seem to leave less of an impact than other kinds of catastrophes. If you think of, say, for example, the impact of wars, people remember the impact of wars very vividly. But if you contrast it with the way people's historical memory of pandemics, there's far less trace that people actually, that these events register. And what's very interesting in the Indian case is that in the period between the 1880s and the 1920s, India suffered a series of medical catastrophes. You had plague, of course, but you also had cholera, you had all kinds of epidemic diseases, you had influenza in 1918, 1919, which is why actually India's urban population wasn't growing very much in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's only after the 1930s that you embark on this secular run of population growth decade by decade. And one reason for that, of course, is that alongside famines, epidemic disease was rife in India, colonial India, in the late 19th century. And yet it's very curious that we actually don't have much of a sense of this. Perhaps if one goes back and recovers sort of through oral history, family lore, you will hear of people who died in their youth, and especially in the generations that came to adulthood in the period between the First and the Second World War. I've heard in my family, for example, of people who died, when they were in their 30s and 40s, and so family structures are affected and so on. So I just wanted to start off with this point, simply because at this moment it seems to us that this pandemic is the most important thing. It's an absolute catastrophe, and we're all affected by it simultaneously in many ways. Um, but it's also worth remembering that we might not feel the same way in once this recedes and it becomes it goes into the past. We might not, the immediacy of this pain will dissipate, and it'll just become one of those things that happened in the past, and that's what seems to have happened in previous pandemics. So the plague pandemic is a good example of what I'm saying. Very few people in Bombay actually have any sense that between 1896, September 1896, when the plague was first publicly identified and declared in Bombay, to 1914, Bombay had over 1 million deaths because of plague. Across India, in that same period, plague is estimated to have killed, at least at a conservative estimate, 12 million people. And yet, plague has left very little impress in the public memory of Bombay itself. I mean, people have some hazy sense that you had something called the plague, but lots of people don't even know that actually. Um, the plague was, I think, a fundamental turning point in the history of colonial India, but specifically in the interests of in the history of Bombay. And I want to focus on Bombay because, of course, that was where it was first discovered and, as I said, identified and publicly announced. And that is where also its most immediate impact was first felt. Afterwards, the plague spread and became much like I'm sure COVID will. It spread into the countryside. And curiously, even though the event created the sensation of the event was felt, plague was experienced as an event most intensely between 1896 and 1900. The death rate from plague was actually much higher after it had ceased to become such a panic-inducing event. Plague became endemic from the early 1900s, and it recurred every year, and it actually killed more people over that period. So I think there is something to be, in terms of thinking about the present, it's a point worth pondering. But to return to Bombay, plague is a big turning point in the history of Bombay for two reasons. It completely transforms the nature of urban governance in the city, and it also has significant consequences for the history of urban civil society. And I want to focus on these two tracks because I think that might provide a way of analytically thinking about the present, to think of, what does a pandemic do to the state and what does the pandemic do to society and specifically to civil society. If you take these two analytical strands, then focusing on the state first, one of the things that I argued in my book on this topic was that until the 1890s, the civic infrastructure in Bombay was in quite a bad state. And that was because even though Bombay had been industrializing from the mid 1850s, it really takes off in the 1870s, but the first cotton mill was set up in the mid 1850s. Between the 1870s and 1890s, Bombay rapidly industrialized. And you had a large urban working class population that came to reside in the city. You had lots of cotton mills, but the civic infrastructure was very pre-industrial. So sanitary standards were very poor. The working classes lived in very abysmal housing conditions. The areas around the docks and the mills were crowded with ramshackle buildings and huts and overcrowding and so on. And the plague, in a sense, when it was discovered, disrupted the existing structure because the colonial government was so panic-stricken by the occurrence of a disease which had all these historic memories in folklore of the Black Death and so on. So when the plague was discovered, uh, uh, one of the first acts of the government was, of course, to engage in this massive intervention in the urban localities of the city. And that, as I said, had to do with the panic that the plague triggered. And this was a panic which caught up all arms of the government, the medical establishment, the civilian establishment. And as I've shown in my book, it unleashed one of the most fearsome state interventions within local colonized local societies. I mean, this kind of event hadn't been seen in India since the summer of 1857, when you had the Great Rebellion. Because, of course, between the 1850s, between the rebellion and the mid-1890s, before the plague broke out, the colonial government was noted for its reluctance to intervene within Indian society because they'd become so nervous about their interventions. But the plague forced them to change this attitude. And the biggest change was in relation to urban governance, because the way the colonial authorities ran the city was essentially, in terms of the sanitary infrastructure, they tended to very much focus on the European parts of the city, which is why the sanitary infrastructure in the Indian parts of the city was in a very poor condition. And in terms of the way they maintained order in the city, they tended to work through local communities, the leaders of local communities. So it was almost like a indirect form of governance. And they didn't want to get involved in the politics of neighborhoods or intervene in local neighborhoods unless there was something very pressing, unless the local leaderships could not keep control. So you had this indirect form of control, and you had the sanitary neglect, as I say. And both these elements were completely overturned by the plague, because the plague, the fears about the disease, the idea, remember in the early years, it was not clear how the plague spread. So again, you have some very interesting parallels with COVID, because the initial sort of understandings of the disease were very rudimentary. They knew a bacteria caused it, but they didn't know how, what the etiology of the disease was. And as I said, there was this blind panic. So one consequence of that is this massive state intervention, which completely overturns the previous policy of non-interference within the structures of urban governance. And the significant point in terms of urban development is that, and this is again a point that I highlighted through my research, which is that there were two understandings of the plague. One was that it was a disease that was contagious, that was spread from person to person. So in order to control the plague, you had to break the chains of transmission, much like we are doing today. And so you segregate people, you take infected people to hospital, you segregate the contacts in camps, and you try and break the chains and you set up quarantines within neighborhoods so that you try and prevent the transmission of the disease. Now, opposed to that was an older perspective, which basically had been very long established in Bombay, which tended to see a direct causal link between the environmental conditions, in any particular locality and the diseases that proliferated there. So within this reading, plague came to be seen as a disease of locality, as I've argued. So it came to be seen, so they accepted, so this I call the localist theory, which is people who held this theory argued that plague was a disease of filth and overcrowding and poverty. And this was the framework that had existed to explain diseases in Bombay for well over half a century. And so those who held this view basically reconciled the idea that plague was caused by a microbe or bacterium with the idea that this bacteria was generated by filth. And this localist perspective had significant consequences for the colonial policies, because if you believed in contagionist theory, you essentially focused on the body of the people. You tried to keep people apart. You tried to keep the infected in hospitals. You tried to keep the contacts in segregation camps and so on. But if you believed in the localist theory, the focus was not so much the human body, it was the environmental conditions of the areas where the disease was found. Now, what happens in Bombay is essentially a mixture of these two theories, and I call this contingent contagionism. And essentially what that means is that plague, it was accepted, was a disease of poverty and filth, and that in the first instance, it affected those who lived in insanitary neighborhoods. So the focus had to be not on the human body in some arbitrary fashion, as some historians had argued before me, but actually that plague was very much carried by poor people, because the poor lived in these filthy neighborhoods. So in order to stamp out the plague, you basically had to address the problem of these poverty-ridden neighborhoods, the abysmal conditions in which the poor lived, and to confine the poor in hospitals, which is why when the plague broke out, one of the things that the municipal commissioner did was to issue a proclamation saying anybody who was affected, was found to be infected would be taken to hospital. Now, all the urban elites, the Indian elites, the merchant classes, educated people protested. They protested to the municipal commissioner saying, if we can look after the person at home, they shouldn't be taken to hospital. Because remember, this was a time when the hospital idea of the hospital was still a forbiddingly alien one. So what happened was that you had the municipal commissioner then rescinded his original order, and he said only those who could not afford to be treated at home would be taken to hospital. So if you look at the hospital statistics for that period, the first year of the epidemic, it was essentially poor people living in the neighborhoods, and the slums, what the areas designated as slums, were being taken to, taken to hospital. But the key point here then is that because of this mixture of the localist and the contagionist theory, the focus of plague policy in Bombay and by extension in other places was essentially both the urban neighborhoods and the people who lived in those neighborhoods. So there was an explicit class basis to the plague policies. So why is this important? Historians before me had tended to argue that the basis of plague policy in Bombay was essentially race, that it was essentially, the British trying to target Indians, and it was an assault on the body of the colonized. What wasn't recognized sufficiently in this explanation was that actually the plague policy had a very strong class basis to it, and that it was really essentially the urban poor who were targeted. And the localist policy also had a second dimension, which had longer term consequences, and I think that is relevant for what we want to talk about today. And that is that because the plague was understood to be a disease of localities, and it was understood to be something that affected the poor in the first instance, and that it was something that affected those who lived in these areas that were designated slums, that the way to deal with it then was to engage in long-term civic planning. So you have the creation of the Bombay Improvement Trust in November 1898. And over the next 25 years, the Bombay Improvement Trust is absolutely central in remaking Bombay. I won't go into the details of the trust's activities because that's a separate topic, and I can perhaps expand on that in further in the discussion. But this is very critical because the Bombay Improvement Trust was the first attempt of this kind, the first initiative of this kind, to set up an urban agency explicitly tasked with the task of civic development, and tasked with the idea of remaking the city. And it became the model for subsequent attempts to, subsequent urban development initiatives in other cities. This whole idea of the improvement trust, which is essentially an executive body dominated by colonial officials and unencumbered by a responsibility to local authorities, elected authorities. So that's one way in which we can think of how the plague is a very significant cataclysmic event in transforming the structure of urban governance, and which is through the way in which it forces the colonial authorities to think of urban planning in the context of this epidemic. And because the reason it happens is because of this prior conceptual understanding of the plague as being caused, as being a disease of locality, and essentially affecting those who lived in the poorer neighborhoods of the city. If we turn to the other aspect, which is the impact of the plague on society, urban society, as we know, pandemics very brutally expose the existing structures within society, the inequities within society, the nature of class relations, the distribution of power, the distribution of wealth. All of these are brutally exposed in a pandemic, as we are seeing today. And that was the case even with the plague in the late 1890s. What's very interesting, of course, is that one can see two contrary logics playing out. One was a logic in which communities responded to the plague in terms of their pre-existing structures. So because this was this was a colonized society in which religion and caste was seen to be the basis of social identities, and communities self-identified in those terms. And Bombay, of course, had myriad communities of this kind. The first instinct, the first sort of impact of the plague was in deepening this kind of um, um, the segmentation, if you will, of civil society. By that I mean that each community and caste would mobilize resources for itself to look after its members. And that is how, if you look at the early initiatives to form, the early medical infrastructure initiatives, they were largely community-based, caste-based, and we still have the legacy of that. You'll have things like the Bhatia Hospital, or you'll have, the Parsi Hospital, and so on. So each community mobilizing resources within itself, and to deal with the needs of its own members. And this was to have a very significant impact, in a sense, because different communities showed different levels of receptivity to the policies of the state. Some communities were willing to collaborate with the colonial state. Other communities were less willing to do so. And if you look at the points of conflict over the implementation of plague policy, we see these tensions in the local community relations with the colonial authorities. And one significant consequence, of course, for urban governance, with regard to the way in which order was maintained in the colonial city, was that the colonial authorities found that they could not rely on their old structures of power. Remember, before the mid 1890s, before the crisis of the plague, the colonial authorities had largely relied on existing structures, traditional leaders, caste headmen, religious leaders, etc. Those who had traditionally maintained orders within the neighborhood. And there was an implicit sort of contract between the state, an informal contract between the state and these leaderships, that they would keep order in their neighborhoods, and they would, they would handle things within it. And the state would help to buttress their authority, right, through various forms of recognition. Now, what happened in the context of the plague was very similar to what we are seeing now, is that existing structures of authority come to be questioned because of the panic, because of the clear inability of the state to deal with the scale of the crisis, the fact that the colonial authorities deepened, the fact that they were intervening so directly in the homes of people, they were entering neighborhoods, they were entering sort of localities, and pulling out people and taking them to hospital or confining them in camps. All of this triggered huge unrest. And of course, we know that in Pune, for example, it leads to the assassination of W.C. Rand by Damodar Chapekar, and of course, that has its own sort of, the sedition trial of Tilak and so on. It gets drawn into nationalist politics. In Bombay, you had the same amount of unrest. You had two major riots. You had a riot in 1896, where you had an attack on hospitals and so on, and then a much bigger riot in March 1898, when a plague search party tries to go into the neighborhood of the weaving community, the Julahas in Bombay, tries to extricate a 12-year-old girl who's affected by the plague, and that triggers a riot. So you find that existing structures of authority come to be questioned. The old collaborators that the British relied on were found wanting. So one of the things that happens, which longer-term consequences for urban governance, is that the state has to expand its networks of allies, sort of collaborators, and it starts allying itself with groups who had previously not wielded power, but were now new sources of informal power in the neighborhood. So people who came from much more plebeian backgrounds, and this begins to reflect Bombay's own transformation into a working class city. That now it's understood that these guys who you've been dealing with before may control the council chambers. They may have been traditionally legitimated sources of authority, but they're no longer, their writ no longer runs on the street. You have to reach out to guys who run liquor shops or taverns and so on. So there's a very, it opens up a space in which the local workings of colonial power get enmeshed with the local workings or the power balances within the city at the level on the street. So you have these new informal alliances between the state and the police on the one hand, and these new sources of authority on the other. A contrary dynamic at the level of civil society is between is how people So one dynamic, as I said, was that people, were working within structures of community. The other dynamic runs counter to this, which is that communities begin to transcend their sectionalism and start thinking in terms of, you have more generalized notions of the common good, that something like health, public health is a matter that affects different communities, and there should be a greater consensus between these communities. So you see a space opening up for a dialogue between different communities. And I think that, again, is very significant, because if you think of why there's been a lot of talk now of how Bombay has succeeded, where Delhi has struggled. And I think that has a lot to do with the structures of civil society in Bombay and the way they work. And one thing about that is very impressive is how it transcends these sectarian, communitarian lines, and people work across community boundaries, and especially at a time of emergency. It may not always be the case in other instances, but certainly during emergencies, you find the mobilization of resources across community lines. Now that really starts with the plague, because what you find is different groups coming together and pursuing measures that will alleviate suffering, and making a case for a more universalist, more generalist argument for how society should mobilize. And you see this in the newspapers of the time, you see this through particular civic initiatives. It's after the outbreak of the plague that you actually get the emergence of what one might call a hygienic modernity, as Ruth Rogatsky, who works on urban China, has called it, which is essentially this notion that that a productive population is one that has to be a healthy population, and that requires certain kinds of modern investments and technologies and techniques, including things like hospitals and so on. And you get a new kind of sanitary awareness. So you have things like the Bombay Sanitary Association that's formed in 1904, largely dominated by Indian doctors and so on. It's set up by, much like the Congress, which was set up by Allen Octavian Hume, and then it's taken over by Indians. Similarly, this was set up by the health officer, J.H. Turner, but very quickly overrun by Indian professionals, doctors, and so on. So you have campaigns for spreading sanitary awareness. You have a new emphasis on, the need for public health, and you have a recognition that this is something that should be a focus of civil society as a whole. It's not something that simply pertains to one community or the other. So I suppose to sort of summarize some of what I've been saying, the plague, in my view, is the single biggest turning point in Bombay's urban history. And it is so for the reasons I've sketched. It transforms, with hugely consequential effects, the nature of urban governance. The colonial state is forced to give up its policy of what one historian has called salutary neglect or salutary indifference to questions of urban planning and civic infrastructure. In the form of the Bombay Improvement Trust, you have a long-term legacy, which was to fundamentally transform Bombay's. The Bombay that we know today is largely created by the activities of the Bombay Improvement Trust, and that's very much a legacy of the plague. And secondly, at the levels of civil society, you see the plague transforms. At one level, it deepens a certain kind of segmentation, but you also get this contrary logic where you get the emergence of a sense of a civil society that begins to focus on questions of public health and becomes interested in questions of the link between poverty, sanitation, and so on. And one of the longer term consequences of that is an institution like the Social Service League, which was to perform, undertake a lot of social activities in the city, focusing on urban problems and focusing on slums and so on. I think I'm going to just stop here because there's quite a lot of issues here, but I'm happy to expand on any particular points that you want me to talk about.
So, yeah, before I ask you specific questions, because there are many other things that as well happen in Mumbai after setting up of improvement trust, I just want to bring in the story of Ahmedabad here. Much as what Prashant said, British didn't interfere much into how the governance of the neighborhoods happened, and it was very much left to the what we call in Ahmedabad Port Panchayat, who actually managed the day-to-day governance of the city. Now, Ahmedabad's trajectory is very different than Mumbai because it was the local indigenous leadership that took initiative in improving the city's public health issues. The first Indian, the Ahmedabadi person, Rancho Lal Chotalal, who became the first president of Ahmedabad municipality, which was set up in 1880. There's a long history of how this governance institutions were created, and they were linked to all the Bombay presidency rules that were set up on urban governance by the British. But Rancho Lal's very famous statement is that the most important duty of the municipality is to look after the public health. And he says that in 1883. And so it's his initiative. He pushed through at that point in time reforms on sanitation. I mean, there are two very, very important issues that were being addressed in Ahmedabad over time was giving clean water supply and sanitation. Because earlier the sanitation was what we call septic tanks or the pits, sanitation pits. Water would leach, the waste would leach into the ground and it would go into River Sabarmati. And so when, and the main source of water was also River Sabarmati. And so when the water was pulled out, it was all filthy and it led to cholera outbreaks. I mean, Ahmedabad has long periods of cholera outbreak. It also had a plague multiple times around the same time that Mumbai had experienced. And so the main effort was now the critical issue. And so there were two camps in Ahmedabad city, which is, as it, I think it comes from British, of a camp which was of improvers in the city and the conservatives in the city. And so the one British visitor told at that time that there are two parties. There's one party which is a reforming party, and another party which is a muck party, not supporting sanitation reforms. Partly British did come in and wanted to intervene as to how the toilets which were there in the neighborhoods were emptied and cleaned out, which the Indians didn't like. They didn't want British to interfere in their everyday affairs, and they were using the services of sweepers in the caste hierarchy to clean up these toilets. And they didn't want, because finally, if the government comes in, the big question comes in: who's going to finance this?
Yeah.
The issue of finance was central to all the conflicts that were going on. Yeah. And there were either the British were suggesting to impose a house tax collected from everybody so that the municipality could provide services, including sanitation. And the residents were saying that they wanted the trade tax, which then subsequently became octroi in city. So there was and have been a constant sort of conflict on the taxation part. But the important point is that there were two important issues in Ahmedabad. One is that it was the civic leadership, and at various points of time, the civic leadership arose to task to set up, and so it was all indigenous efforts. There was, for the first drainage line, loan was taken by the municipality to set up that in the city. The second important point is that in 1917, when Sardar Patel comes and he becomes one of the members of the Ahmedabad Municipal Commission, and then he becomes the president of municipality in 1924. And he then sort of brought Ahmedabad and its elite into the nationalist movement. And so they were seeing Congress Party and the position of Sardar Patel as the president of the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation as a way to bring Ahmedabad into the nationalist movement. Gandhiji already had been there in the city participating in various activities. In fact, Gandhi Ashram was very badly affected by the influenza of 1918, 1990. Many ashram inmates were ill. Even Gandhiji himself had fallen into influenza at that point in time. So, so there is a little bit different. The other point is that Ahmedabad was part of Bombay presidency. And the kind of conflicts and issues that Prashant discussed, we didn't find that. Even Ahmedabad did not adopt the Improvement Trust Act, though It was applied in Mumbai, and then Pune subsequently had improvement trust. But Ahmedabad did not get, even though it was part of Mumbai presidency. So Ahmedabad is one of the large cities that didn't have an improvement trust. And all the improvement efforts were indigenous, not through the legal instrument available at that time. And then in 1924-25, a mechanism of planning, which was called town planning scheme mechanism, comes in practice and been implemented, which meant land was taken away for public purposes to set up in sanitation, roads, etc. There was a huge conflict in Ahmedabad municipality where Sardar Patel opened up the areas around, outside the municipal, after on the other side of the river Sabarmati. People knew it. And so there's also a story of Ahmedabad of not just civic leadership rising, but also people within the civic leadership who were wanting to they were vested interest within the government, who were trying to not let some of the reforms occur. Some were thinking of any new initiatives would turn into more profit-making real estate ventures. And so all these other conflicts that you see in cities constantly, because whenever a road is laid or improvement happens, there's always impact on the property prices. And so those tussles, conflicts were also part of Ahmedabad's history. But somehow Ahmedabad was able to sort of set this up with due to civic leadership and improve urban sanitation at that point in time. And then it went into planning efforts. There were also, Sardar Patel actually lost power in municipality because the landed mafia at that point in time did not like to give away land for town planning scheme implementation. So there is that story of a little bit of difference between Ahmedabad and Mumbai, though they were both part of Bombay presidency at that time, and a lot of local level initiatives, civic society initiatives, local culture played a lot of influence on how cities' public health was sort of addressed. Prashant, I had a question, because I have read somewhere that Improvement Trust also led to cleaning up of low-income areas in Mumbai,
Yeah.
and that areas that were around where the British lived were all sanitized, and the working class was pushed out of area from the central parts of that time central parts. But there's also, if we connect that to Mumbai's own history, there's always been sanitization efforts in Mumbai for being pushed out and pushed out and pushed out continuously, even in independent India.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. The Improvement Trust in its early years essentially focused on the areas that had been affected by the plague, where the plague was seen to have taken root. And that was essentially the areas in what is now, of course, sort of central Bombay. And this is basically the areas starting from what they call the old Indian town, which is now today would be South Bombay, Girgaon and all those areas around it. And the idea was essentially twofold. One was that you had to pull down what they called slums and so on, and insanitary housing. And of course, it's worth pointing out that the idea of the slum in that discourse is not the same as what today, when we think of slums, we think of what, in Hindi would say jhopadpatti or whatever, right? But when they were talking about slums in the 1890s, they were actually talking about these slightly dilapidated structures, but were still pakka structures, which they regarded as overcrowded and insanitary and crowded together. I think their biggest fear was this idea of things crowded together, because the contrast was with the British areas, which would be, of course, much more spatially laid out and spaced out and so on. And of course, the idea was that they would pull down these so-called slums, and then they would build new sanitary housing in its place. Now, what happened was, of course, that they started pulling down these structures before they'd fully planned for what the relocation plans were and how they would rehouse. So the consequence was that they ended up dishousing more people than they could rehouse. And of course, as they start building these new structures, they realized that their earlier estimate, the first estimates, where they thought they would provide housing for the working classes, at low rates, that was not financially sustainable according to their models. And they quickly started finding ways of trying to get rid of that responsibility. And the housing that they build is actually taken over by what we would call lower middle class people, not the working class per se. Um, because they couldn't afford the rent, and the trust had all these strictures about how many people could be in a room, and so on. Whereas the working classes often, they would split, they would lower their rental costs by sharing rooms with other workers and so on. So those practices were not allowed. And so essentially, the short answer to this is that they end up worsening the conditions of sanitation and overcrowding that they have set out to ameliorate. I think what is very interesting is that, for me, the key thing was how the trust very quickly comes to be, even though it is run by the colonial authorities and it is dominated by colonial officials. Indian property interests very quickly come to establish a stranglehold over its operations on the ground. Because what happens is that the trust has to deal with local property owners, and there it gets completely mired down in, they haven't got a model at the outset of the compensation policies they're going to follow. So those are constantly changing, and Indian local property elites start using mechanisms of the law and so on to kind of contest attempts to take over their properties. In many cases, they use the compensation law to get much larger compensations than that they should have perhaps got. So one of the things that happens is with the trust is that it actually embeds Indian property interests more firmly, and in a sense the city comes to be. And so by the time the British kind of leave, these Indian property interests have consolidated their hold over the urban property market. And that's something that had started before the plague, because even by the 1890s you had Indians moving into elite European areas like Malabar Hill and so on. By the 1930s and 40s, the property market is largely dominated by Indians. The Europeans become a marginal element. And by the 30s, of course, the trust has been around for, well over 30 years and so on. So the trust actually becomes a mechanism, even though it's a colonial agency, it gets taken over by Indian interests over time, not at the outset, but over time, and that reflects the changing power structure in the city. Because even by the end of the 30s, even though Bombay is a colonial city in the sense that it's, the British are still there, it's really the Indians who are driving on the ground, who are controlling, the municipal corporation, the property market, and so on. So it's a very interesting story that, how urban development actually unfolds in practice. But you're right that in a sense, in the early years, it was very much, the colonial authorities' fear of disease which drives it. And this is, again, I think, a longer term thing in terms of our own present predicament. As I said, as the urgency of a pandemic recedes, and we can see this, I can see this happening even with COVID, that, that in the early years, the focus of the Bombay Improvement Trust was very much about sanitary change. But by the 1900s, the trust itself is starting to operate like a propertied interest in its own right, rather than, the sanitary question gradually begins to diminish in significance as far as the focus of its operations go. But I had one question for you, Darshini, which is the plague and the influenza epidemics. One of the things that's always struck me is that the plague in Bombay led to, as I said, to all these wholesale changes and huge transformations in the urban landscape, and this huge investment through the Improvement Trust in civic planning. But the influenza epidemic in Bombay doesn't seem to have had the same impact on, on urban development. And in a sense, the influenza epidemic is actually much more significant for civil society, because an organization like the Social Service League really becomes into its own through the campaigning work that it does for mobilizing civil society resources to tackle the influenza epidemic. So there's a clear difference between, so when we talk of pandemics, each pandemic also has its own dynamic.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the plague, I think, because it had all these connotations of the Black Death and the fear of, the disease and so on, elicited this huge panic-induced response. The influenza epidemic, which was actually quite severe, and in 1918, 1919, it had a huge impact on Western India and other parts of India too. But certainly in Bombay, it did have a huge impact. That played out very differently. It didn't generate in terms of, these sorts of consequential responses from the state and so on. It had less of a impact there, even though the mortality rates were very high and so on. And that does raise the question of, what accounts for these differences between one pandemic and the other, because that, I think, will also have consequences for how we think about the COVID in relation to the past.
Yeah, so this is very interesting. I've been thinking about it, that when we look at pandemic, we need to look at, there have been differences in the response to it. Even for Ahmedabad, we don't hear much about how influenza was addressed, except that the Home Rule League local branch came and started attending to the people who were affected and dealing with it. It was treated, it was more, what do we say, curative side of interventions rather than, whereas the plague and even cholera had a response on the preventive side. And that's where the Improvement Trust set huge sanitation programs across Europe as a response to all the European cities, as a response to plague, cholera comes in. So on, which is not there for influenza. And that's why the question now is that what would happen going now forward on COVID? This COVID is not, earlier it was, and when it broke out about a year and a half back, and India also, it was thought that it would be spreading into high dense areas, in the slum areas, and the poor would be the victims of this pandemic more than middle classes and the rich. But what turned out to be is different in the initial phase. Even if you map wherever, very little statistics are available, but it can be mapped. We did some exercise for Ahmedabad. We did see that in let's say March and April, the first areas that were sort of affected were high density areas. And we thought that we need to address that, but then it moves to middle income and higher income areas, and that's where it stayed put. And so if you look at speciality of COVID, it's still not very clear. Now in the second phase, given the virulence of the second wave and the new variants, everybody seems to have now got affected, irrespective of the class dimension of in the city. The class dimension would and is playing out now in terms of how people are getting treatment. So even now, if I don't know whether COVID is going to have any impact on the way preventive care would be looked at, whether it has any implications on that. I was reading something about TB, that due to TB outbreaks in, say, Europe, in Paris, they came up with a solution that they kept very large windows in the house so that there's a cross ventilation possible. Even in this case, it said that we need to have more ventilation now, what are going to be the consequences of that? And that comes in bit of conflict with what is called urban. Because urban is defined by density, and Indian definition is density itself, but Indian density thresholds are very low, even that density you find in rural areas in India. But whatever, it's defined by density and close activities. And so how does that, and I'm not sure whether there's going to be any sort of impact on planning per se, as improvement trusts and then urban planning activities have had subsequently. It's also true that whenever urban planning interventions happen in situations where there's high inequality, it's the real estate that takes over them and starts engineering their interest through various interventions that happen subsequently. Now, I'm not sure what will happen, and I think there could be questions and suggestions from the audience that are here. Is it time to do that? So,
I was thinking that I could see a few questions here, comments here, which are relevant. I think Amita's point about, how COVID was seen is, the sort of the class dimension of it and the spatial dimension of it. And there are others also who are talking about, diseases and disease theory, the specificity of that to particular kinds of responses. And I think there was an earlier question. I don't know if we can take the questions, but it seemed to me I could just want to make one point about this. I think what's very important is that the way diseases are understood have very significant consequences for the kinds of responses that are fashioned. And there's a very clear link between the epidemiological and the social, in the sense that, so for example, the localist theory that I identified as being operational in the context of the plague, as I said, that had been evolving from the 1860s. And the reason it had evolved was that it became an explanation for why because the poorer neighborhoods of Bombay constantly suffered very high death rates. Ira Klein pointed out in an article that Bombay had one of the highest death rates between 1870 and 1914. And that high death rate was explained by local medical authorities on the fact that the diseases occurred in particular neighborhoods, and these particular neighborhoods were, filthy, they were insanitary, and they were traditionally places where mortality was highest. So when the plague happened, they wanted to assimilate the plague itself to this older theory and explain it through that. Now, in the case of the plague, because the disease was not, the origins of the disease and how it spread was not understood, this idea that you could have that you could have a contingent contagionism, that is, plague is essentially a disease of locality, and those people who live in that locality are more naturally prone to get it, that acquired plausibility because Europeans were less affected. It became very clear that though they had reacted in this panic-stricken way at the outset, Europeans were much less affected. That there were very few European deaths because of the plague, which is why by 1900 there's a reversal in plague policy. They no longer go for these very harsh interventionist methods. In the case of the influenza epidemic, it seems to me the attitude was much more laissez-faire. They don't seem to have intervened in the same way at all. And it's very interesting that one of the things that happened with COVID was that the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, which was designed to, introduced to combat the plague, because of the panic surrounding the COVID, I suspect that they reached out to that because that is the one thing that allows the state to enter neighborhoods and to enforce controls and so on. So I think that the perception of this, the perception of how a disease is caused or the public understandings of it are very much shaped by pre-existing social assumptions. So in the case of the plague, it became plausible to argue that the poor suffered, that they were the carriers of the disease. In case of influenza, that proved to be much harder to, the epidemiological and the social proved much harder to reconcile. I think in the case of COVID, we are seeing, I think Amita pointed out, and I think this is a very interesting point. I think when it first broke out, the social assumption was that where are the areas that are most likely to be vulnerable, and immediately we drew upon our notions of the slum, right? So we said, oh gosh, you might have COVID in Dharavi and it's going to be a catastrophe. As it turned out, Dharavi actually bucked that trend, and they dealt with it very, on the whole, they dealt with it very effectively given the crisis they were facing. But in this way, for example, all those assumptions have been overturned because now it's suddenly the old idea that Indians have more natural immunity because they keep getting diseases since they're children, and so they can't get COVID or they won't be so badly affected. That's gone out of the window. So as the idea that that COVID will simply be restricted to the slums. I mean, it's been much more. We are much more feeling its effect because in lots of middle class areas, people have been affected and people have died because of it. So the class specific thing has become much harder to sustain. So I think there's this very interesting tension between the epidemiological and the social, that there are social assumptions that drive our understandings, and those are constantly rubbing up against the epidemiological. And I think the interesting thing is to see the nature of that interaction.
I think also in the current time, at least in Indian context, we don't really have much of epidemiological understanding of what is given that the data that we are collecting is still inadequate to understand. We've not done much of genome sequences. We're not collecting regular data. And all of us now know that there's a severe underreporting of cases and so on. So I'm not sure whether we are going to get further understanding of this. And lastly, probably instead of what Amita is asking, are we going to rethink about urbanism? Are we going to just be more satisfied with the vaccine therapy and that approach to the disease? Because that seems to be now the latest understanding of how COVID needs to be handled, and whether we need to think about our cities, whether we need to think about our even public healthcare systems, etc., is still a big question mark given the way current reaction to the COVID is there. Fortunately, this one doesn't carry with itself the class stigma.
Yeah, but the thing is that I think that on the other hand, it's also possible that the nature of that diseases are also very shifting entities. So as COVID is transforming itself, as it's sort of unfolding, you could see that, for example, the fact that it's going into the villages may very well take our attention away from the cities. I mean, it is possible that that the next phase of the crisis will be really about the catastrophe in the villages, because there we don't have any medical thing. And if there is more reportage, it may well be possible. It is possible that the next 6 months, the focus will be actually on the rural rather than the urban, because that's where there are no resources. and the scale of the catastrophe might actually become much more apparent, as we're already seeing, with all these images of these bodies in rivers and so on.
So you're right, because it would would that lead to rethinking of what cities should be and how they should be, because currently in this the paradigm that we have of urban development that's being followed, we've been reading all the plans now, and all of them have the same language of the market-based planning, whatever that means. I don't understand that term. It's a very conflictual term that way, and so basically the whole idea is to how it's something that happened on real estate, jumping into and tying up and taking initiative and then owning it up and driving the improvement trust activity subsequently. Same thing is happening with urban planning. And so in this situation where land doesn't remain a public good, how are any post-COVID or any post-pandemic public goods in the cities to be delivered?
Yeah,
And
I think that's a very big question. And my own sense is that a lot of how these issues are dealt with will depend not so much purely on questions of the medical side of things. I think it's going to be much more shaped by the play of political economy, the play of different interests who will, because as I said, I think that when the urgency, pandemics have two lives in a sense. They have their life as an event when they affect everyone and everyone is caught up in it, and the focus is really on the urgency of the present, of somehow getting through it. And then there is the afterlife of the pandemic. And I think the afterlife of the pandemic, one has seen different kinds of scenarios unfold. We have seen some pandemics which have completely transformed how people do things. There have been other pandemics where it is not clear that they've actually changed very much. And for me, I think a lot will depend on how the next year of COVID unfolds. Because, for example, if you find that vaccine immunity is not a total one and that we have to constantly have precautions of one kind or the other, it will mean that urban areas will have to have social distancing, masking, all these things. Whether you go to watch a film or whether you go to the supermarket, there'll be lots of practices which we may think are temporary now but might become permanent. But you might not get, on the other hand, a kind of fundamental remaking of urban neighborhoods and so on of the kind we saw with the Bombay Improvement Trust. So I think a lot will depend on the kind of the way. And as I said, if COVID moves into the countryside and it's the countryside that is getting more affected, we may actually find urban health neglected because the focus might well be on saving the countryside in a sense. And so in terms of the priorities, we may not see the urban aspect getting as much attention as the rural. We don't know. I think that's a question to
if that happens, there could possibly be a class element coming in once again, because the rural side getting it's the backyard, and only the concern would remain of migrants coming from the rural areas. And so then you would see probably class dynamics sort of panning out. But maybe let us stop.
Yeah, take the question. So
questions, and Sudhir or Bijal, what do you propose we go? How do we go about that?
Yeah, so definitely, I think we can move to the question answers now after that very interesting conversation. I was in fact checking with a few of the participants on whether they would like to unmute and ask their question. Many of them have kindly agreed, and there are some who said, no, today I'm in such a good mood of enjoying this conversation. I just want to listen to it. So that itself shows the kind of vibrancy that your conversation has created. People have been really listening with a lot of interest. I would like to first call upon Lakshmi Subramaniam. If you would please like to ask your question, you may please unmute and do that.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Prashant, and thank you, Darshini, for that really interesting conversation. My question is specifically addressed to Prashant. I see that your analysis is very much, and legitimately so, in the framed in the context of urban history development. I was particularly interested in the way you looked at the improvement trust and all that it implied or did not. I am, however, just curious to see whether you would like to engage with the kind of currency, the whole emphasis on narratives has assumed in the study of epidemics. If we, in fact, look at a long-term perspective on epidemics, all epidemics, I'm thinking about plague, influenza, MERS, SARS, HIV, there is this extraordinary currency that narrative gets. There is a narrative of the epidemic, there is a particular formulaic plot, you have the super spreader, you have the other, you have certain kinds of scapegoating, whether it's typhoid Mary or, patient zero. So I'm just wondering whether or not, as historians, we can in fact look at narrative more consciously. And I'm saying this advisedly, particularly because we have such a proliferation of media narratives. So while we may argue that things may not change and things may change, it might be rural, might be urban, I'm just trying to figure out whether or not we need to pay much more attention to the way in which every epidemic seems to generate a narrative, and a narrative with a spin.
Yeah. That's absolutely, thank you, Lakshmi. First of all, I hope you're well. It's an absolutely brilliant point. And I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I think you have just suggested the topic for either a book or a conference or something that would be collectively bring together different understandings. But you're absolutely right. And I think I was actually thinking that what this calls for is really a sort of a structuralist analysis of different elements of what goes into a narrative of these sorts of pandemics. And there are clearly, you've kind of identified some of those themes, the scapegoating, for example, or the super spreader events and so on. And you're right that these cut across different pandemics. So actually these are the shared elements, almost like the DNA of the narrative, how it's put, these are the building blocks of these narratives. And obviously the plague lends itself to such an analysis, as do many other pandemics. I think what one would also find is that the nature of the narrative would shift depending on the particular way in which that pandemic is understood by that particular disease is understood by different stakeholders. I think one of the things about the plague is that different sections of society became invested in this panic that the colonial authorities had in their response, which caught up, the whole of society gets caught up in that panic. And that shapes the way they deal with the epidemic. And you're absolutely right. In the case of the plague, as I said, my thing was to show how the poor come to become the seen as the principal carriers, the working classes especially, and the focus is then really on the assault on working class neighborhoods and so on. But in other pandemics, you would have other scapegoats, as we know with, for example, the AIDS epidemics of the late 1980s and so on. I think one of the interesting questions here is, the question of narrative is tied up in my mind with another related theme, and which is the way in which pandemics come to be constructed as events. This is something I've been exploring in some of my other work of how the plague came to be constructed as an event, and it was really constructed as an event in the first immediate, the period between 1896 and 1900, where, you have and it had all the elements of the event, a sudden rupture in historical temporality, a break from the norm, the sudden overturning of existing structures, the social conflicts, and then, and the sort of the gradual resolution of the event with the fact that the colonial authorities changed their plague policies from 1900 onwards. The plague itself becomes an endemic thing. It loses its event-like quality, which is why all the historical focus has really been on those first years of the plague, between 1896 and 1900, because that is when the eventness of the plague is at its most intense. After that, it becomes part of the routine and part of the everyday life. And I think every pandemic is interesting because every pandemic is an historical event, and the task for the historian is to really see what is the eventness of that particular pandemic. And so the narrative question, I think, is very much tied up with the status of these pandemics as events, as historical events. And I think what you're pointing to is, the distinguishing feature of the event is its singularity and its specificity. The distinguishing feature of what you're talking about is a more structuralist, that it is that it's not so much singularity. The focus is on what different pandemics share with each other. So I think there's an interesting dialectical kind of relationship that one can probe between the eventness of these pandemics and the narrative structures that then allow us to compare different sorts of pandemics, and to compare and contrast them. But I think this is an absolutely brilliant point, and I think this is the kind of work I'm sure it's being done by sort of people in the field, but it's the kind of work that we need. And I think India is actually a good place to do such an exercise, because people, I think Chinmay Tumbe's book recently has pointed out, we had loads of pandemics in the late 19th, early 20th century. And I think for us, this is a bit of a shock, because we have not had anything like this in our lifetimes, certainly. But this was a familiar feature to many Indians before the 1920s. And that's where I think history can speak to the present, and thinking of, the way things were narrativized, the way in which these pandemics came to be seen through particular tropes, through particular frames. And I think that's a very good point.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that response. Next, I would like to invite my colleague, Professor Amol Agarwal, to please ask your question. In the meantime, Professor Mahadevia, if there's any particular question that you wish that it should be addressed, or Professor Kidambi, you may please let us know that as well. Amol?
Hi, Prashant, and thanks a lot, Darshini, for this wonderful conversation. One could just go on and on, given the pandemic. And when I heard that Prashant is coming to our university to talk, I thought he'll talk about cricket and his book on the Indian. Maybe we can have another conversation that's given how Indian cricket is shaping up, and it's always a topic of interest. So Prashant, I mean, just a curious question. As you mentioned that the pandemics are not really mentioned as far as history is concerned. So any thoughts on that? Why is it that historians have? So for instance, if we look at this whole 2014 to 19 period, we've seen that there are fair bits of papers, books, and conferences on the First World War, but on the 100 years of Spanish flu. Am I audible, or is it?
Yeah. Yeah, no.
So why is it that is it really a historian's miss that? And in fact, in my own work on, let's say, financial history and banking history and so on and so forth, I find hardly any mention of it. And especially if you want to really compare what the central banks and the banks are doing today to tide off the pandemic, you absolutely see no mention of it in the banking history and financial history books. So I'm kind of curious, how is it that an event as devastating as pandemics misses historians one and all? Thank you.
I think that's a very good point, Amol. I think I should clarify. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I should clarify that I didn't say, my point was not that historians ignore pandemics. I think that would not be fair to, I mean, there's a lot of medical history now, which is a very flourishing field, and pandemics are their bread and butter. There's a lot of academic scholarship. In fact, my own work was in a field which was already very densely populated with lots of fine works on the plague and so on. So I don't think that was my point. I think I was talking more about public, in public memory, in general public memory and public consciousness, these pandemics don't seem to leave the same kind of trace, or have, certainly to my mind, it doesn't seem like they've registered in the same way that big political events or wars seem to have. I was very surprised when I was doing my research on the plague in Bombay, that very few people actually had any sense that Bombay had been so profoundly affected by this epidemic for close to 16 years. The plague came, in 1896 and 1915. The plague was a huge event in Bombay's life. It shaped it in so many ways. But very few people actually, and people didn't even know, people who lived in the Bombay Improvement Trust, chawls and so on, they wouldn't, nobody had any idea that this is why that this chawls were built, that it had this prehistory and so on. So, and certainly that's the case with the influenza epidemic. I think people have no real sense that in 1918, 1919, this pandemic had this huge impact on so many Indian cities and even villages and so on. So I think that was my point. I think medical history is a very flourishing field. Historians work on pandemics. I think what Lakshmi was saying is an interesting point in this regard. It seems to me the kind of work we do with pandemics so for example, this idea of how we think of the narratives that come into play when a pandemic unfolds, I think that is very intellectually very productive to explore this. And perhaps, you should think of, perhaps one can have a conference on this theme, of how different pandemics have come to be narrativized, what are the nature of those narratives, who are the kind of scapegoats in each instance, and so on. So I think that is something worth exploring. But I think work on pandemics itself, historians have been doing work on it. So I wouldn't say that there's been no work or anything. In fact, there's been a lot of historical research. It's more, how does one take that academic literature and map it onto the curious absence of these things in public history. I think the one other thing I would say is that perhaps where there is a gap is that historians who write on this in an academic way have not really reached out to a wider public with this research. And even in school textbooks and so on, I mean, I don't remember coming across the plague. Maybe I did in the case of the Rand assassination, it was there in the background, but there was no real mention of this anywhere in textbooks and so on, other than those cursory references. So I think, we really don't have in the public this thing, that sense of, that these events also happened, that there were social events like this which transformed India. I think that consciousness is perhaps not there so much, but the academic scholarship is certainly on pandemics is huge, I would say.
Yeah, but I would like to tell Amol that what is not available in literature in history is how in the early periods the finances were managed to deal with pandemics, to deal with sanitation, extension of sanitation in cities and so on. We have very, very little idea. There is this discussion on, let's say, improvement trust, but we don't really have any great details about how the money was raised for laying the drains and who contributed. I have just cursorily read that Ahmedabad took a loan, but then how was that repaid back and so on. So I think there is a big hole in even historical analysis on how public goods were delivered in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So I think that's work for somebody like you, Amol. What Aniket is asked, Aniket, the penicillin was found in 1928. And many of the epidemics, especially the cholera, the Black Death, the plague happened before that. That's where some of the, what Prashant calls localized intervention, environmental interventions happen in the cities, because there had to be no option but to prevent the occurrence of this. In the current narrative about COVID, I think what you say, Aniket, is to have a you're saying nationalization of public health infrastructure, that's fine. However, going forward, we think that the vaccine and the innovations in medicine is going to help us to prevent the spread and also cure. It's more on the side of curative side that we are thinking, and vaccine is on the preventive side. But we still have no idea on the environmental side as to whether there is going to be need to deal with local environmental issues, deal with situations at the neighborhood level to be able to address COVID. But even any future pandemics come, are we going to, now that we know and we have this big history and understanding of how pandemics have been addressed, that can there be going forward in urban space more localized attention to addressing pandemics? Can there be more decentralization of health infrastructure, care systems? Something that I think a little bit of experiment of that has happened in Mumbai on dealing with affected population in Dharavi, and they created local level structures to deal with that. And can that be scaled up at the city level and have more decentralized health infrastructure?
Yeah. I think, can I just make one point here before we take it? I think one thing that I wanted to say earlier, which I missed saying, was that, and this again may speak to Lakshmi's point about how we narrativize these things. I think, as you said, pandemics are often grafted into existing social structures and systems and attitudes and so on, and they kind of tell us a lot about those. what we saw, for example, with the stigmatization of particular groups, I think religion was a key factor in how particular groups were stigmatized. But what I'm finding interesting is where caste comes into all of this, because if you think of social distancing in a caste-ridden society, it seems to me, what are the implications of social distancing and caste? Because at one level you could say caste itself is a form of social distancing. How is social distancing going to play in a context where caste is such an important part of everyday life? I think people have been focusing on the religious, stigmatization and so on, but I think caste is an equally important factor, and what its how. I mean, I don't have any answer. I'm throwing it out more as a question, but it seems to me, both in urban and rural India, the question of caste and the pandemic is, I think, a very central one. And we need to think about what the implications and what the consequences of this might be.
Prashant, I was just thinking while you were saying that if this epidemic, this pandemic had come 20 years back, we would have stigmatization on religious basis. I doubt that, because that's a particular narrative one is wanting to create in the current context, political context. But yeah, it's not just the caste inequalities and social distance. We also have many other social distances in India: migrants versus non-migrants, workers versus manual workers versus non-manual workers, and so on. So there are probably going to be playing out of, because you keeping distance, you keep distance. There could be possibly more enclavization, more ghettoization. As we go on in the cities, to keep what we call social distance rather than physical distance. So there could be a new narratives emerging, people's reactions emerging. I don't know.
Yeah, but I think this is where one feels that the only way one can actually answer these questions is through empirical research, even though it will be very challenging to do this research. But I think it's actually quite a pressing thing in some ways to think, to see what actually is happening.
It's a research set up for next decade or so, because this is one needs to observe that for a long period of time of how people are reacting to keeping the distance. Or maybe people are just happy keeping. I don't know how vaccines are going to pan out. It all depends on how that happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. I think there is so much of a possibility for answering the unanswered questions, and also questions which keep emerging as we go through this pandemic. 2020, many people thought, okay, this is it. 21 has shown a completely different picture across the globe, I would say, including, of course, not to mention India. There is a question which is more sector specific, although I would also say we have touched 5:30 exactly, 5:30 p.m. on that note. So, Professor Kidambi, would you mind if we take some more time and also
Sure. No problem.
Maybe a couple of more minutes for a few more questions?
Fine, absolutely fine. That's absolutely
fine. All right, thank you. So we have a question which is more sector specific from Somin Mazumdar. What effect did the plague and influenza epidemic have on the pharma development and scientific development among the two cities that we are talking about today?
I have to say, I don't know very much about this particular topic. So maybe Darshini, you can take this one.
Pharma development. I don't know about historical of how the pharma development happened. So I don't know. Penicillin, I know that much, that the first antibiotic came much after these two pandemics. So I'm not sure whether pharma development happened at that point in time. And hence, my guess is that probably it's because of that, the preventive side had a much larger role to play. But in the current context, because of such advance in the medicine field, there's now more pharmaceutical level responses.
If one broadens the question out and not just focuses on the pharma industry per se, but just medical care as a whole, I do think these pandemics are quite important, because if you think of hospitals as places of the modern hospital as a social institution to which you take patients and so on, I think the fact that you had these repeated pandemics and the fact that these hospitals emerged from the late 1890s and then gradually over the course of the early 20th century, and now medical historians are beginning to trace these histories, certainly for Bombay. I had a student, Mrinmay Satam, who worked on public health in the interwar period, where you looked at hospitals and so on. I do think the naturalization of the idea that you take the sick to hospital, that is a very interesting thing, which is very much, I think, tied up with these pandemics. And certainly by the 1930s and 40s, it becomes an idea that is much more accepted. Of course, I think the hold of traditional forms of healing and so on, and traditional medical techniques and medical ideas are still quite strong. But it is certainly the case that in cities, the provision of health care, especially in Bombay by the local municipal corporation, is a very significant factor in the growth of this sort of idea of, the hospital is where you take people who are sick and so on. And in fact, in the Second World War, I think one of the reasons why you get these migrants coming from the rural areas to the cities is also because of the greater provision, the fact that greater health resources are concentrated in cities. I do think that the relationship between the healthcare industries and the urban context becomes very quite important. So I think, but I can't answer the question about the pharmaceutical industry in particular. It seems to me that medical provision, modern medical provision, and certainly hospital care certainly is very much tied up with the history of these pandemics.
Indeed. Just as you were mentioning this, I could think about how a lot of research opportunities have also arisen. And there is a question from our colleague, Professor Bhargav Atvaryu, on the same line. So, Bhargav, would you like to please ask your question? Bhargav? Okay, he had just shared the question with me, so I thought he may be here. But nevertheless, I will ask the question that.
But meanwhile, I think that Chinmay has just made a very important point here. I just saw that on the chat. You're right, Chinmay, the Hafkin Institute. I was not thinking so much about it in relation to the pharma industry, but you're absolutely right that both the Hafkin Institute and the Serum Institute were in a sense, very much tied up with that. So you could say that, that is clearly an important point. So that's a very good point. Thanks very much for that, Chinmay.
So I think I will also take that opportunity to thank Chinmay for being here today, of course, and also earlier he has been a part of our conversation series with.
And I think I should say that his work was actually quite important in a way, because this point we were saying about publicizing this fact about the pandemics and their impact. I think his new book has filled an important, it's addressed that need, I think, to have more such work. So because there's, as I said, there's a flourishing academic field, but people outside don't really know about this work. And so to kind of write that book that he did, I think was very good. And so, but that Hafkin point is a very important one. And I think that again points to these sort of the longer term consequences of these pandemics.
So I have read about Ahmedabad that there were vaccinations in the 19th century in Ahmedabad city being carried out. But beyond that, we don't have much of information on where the vaccines came from and so on.
Sorry, I kind of missed out on the connection. So, Darshini, I'm not sure if I heard you correctly.
Oh, anyway, so I just said about vaccines that Ahmedabad did have vaccination in the 19th century. We don't have any further details on it.
Correct. I'm just going to take a minute to share the link of Chinmay's conversation, which had taken place in this conversation series on the 13th of March, for those who may be interested, and Professor Kidambi for you as well. It was indeed a very interesting conversation on the pandemic's panic and preparedness, decoding the past to decipher the present and delineate the future. And thank you, Chinmay, for that conversation and also for being here today. Shall we take one more question before we wrap up the conversation today? Is there any particular question that you would like to address, or shall I? For one. There's a question from Solly Benjamin, but it's a fairly long one. So, Solly, would you like to say something about the question you have?
Yeah, hello. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Uh, I think the first question was the main issue was raising is whether the importance of a sort of a speciality analysis, especially because as we saw in our current pandemic, the kind of contested sort of range of opinions around medical rationality. And I think coming back to this really important point, what Lakshmi raised about narratives, is each of these narratives create a kind of speciality. And maybe sort of trying to think about, speciality in a Doreen Massey way, I just want to underline, it's not geographical speciality. I think that may be very productive to even look at how different kind of contestations over what is the public funding onto the Serum Institute, what is the political stuff that's happening. I think so. I was wondering whether there's a kind of a very interesting, especially coming from Professor Kidambi, sort of analysis from earlier times, which kind of exposed this speciality. I'm of course not a historian. I must underline that. So I'm more here to learn. And linked to that, I was just thinking about Myron Eckenberg's Plague Boats, which I thought. Sort of was very useful as an account, which showed how Hong Kong moved in terms of public administration. But again, I say this as a non-specialist, a non-historian. Somehow I felt missed that kind of complexities or specialities of public administration. So I was wondering if you like to comment on that. It's more of a methodological issue also.
Yeah. Yeah, but could I just clarify the question? Are you interested more in terms of the spatial logics of the way in which there was a response, the state response to these, or are you talking about the way in which spatial practices are transformed in the wake of pandemics? I'm just trying to clarify.
Yeah, I think it's more spatial practices, because a space has a certain power, and a narrative. Yeah. As I think that's a really important, point to actually have a conference or some kind of working on that, is to how a particular space has a power and it captures the public administration. And you have WhatsApp groups, you have whole range of these kind of spaces which create right from putting cow dung on yourself or drinking urine. Now it's available on Amazon, it's sold out, pineapple flavor, etc. And I'm not trying to what should I say, take a moral stance. All I'm just saying is that, or whether it's good or bad, all I'm just saying is that there's a kind of a dynamic present which has a complexity of how what is disease, what is cure, and there seems to be a really kind of almost sadistic way of opportunity now to see how public policy is not just a well-known virologist who are giving their statements, whom I would like to believe in, and I do. But it's being shaped by a whole range of spaces in that sense.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. I mean, I would read your question slightly differently. I don't see. I mean, certainly, space. Yes. I mean, space can be defined in very different ways. But I actually see this more as a question of how pandemics interact with particular kinds of information orders, within society. There's an information order that is governed by the logics of the state. There's an information order that is generated from within society itself. So these WhatsApp groups would be one kind. And I don't think these are mutually exclusive. What's interesting for me in the case of the plague pandemic is how multiple information orders come into play. So you have the information order that is being created by the colonial state through its censuses and through its policing and through its other kinds of medical policies and so on. And one of the things that the state quickly realizes in the case of the plague pandemic is how unfit for purpose its information order was. One of the things about the plague, when they went about doing these house-to-house searches and so on, is that many colonial authorities have never stepped into these parts of the city. So actually, the plague made the city more. I won't use the word transparent, but it made the city more visible to the governors, in a very interesting way. And so what you find is the colonial authorities themselves, to try and grapple with the problem, are putting together different kind of information registers. They're using census stuff. They're using the information from policing. They're using the information that the medical authorities in Bombay generate, the health officers' reports and so on. And so this question of the narrative that Lakshmi was talking about, the narrative of the plague in this case is constructed by piecing together these different elements of the evolving colonial information order. Then you have within local society itself forms of information circulation, which take, rumors is the most well-known part of it, which has been worked on by historians and so on. But I looked at petitions, in relation to plague policies, and it's remarkable. Many of these petitions were not people there were obviously those who were supplicants who were saying, modify this policy or that. There were lots of people who were giving the state advice. They would say, I know some Baba in Udaipur who can cure the plague. I know somebody in Jaisalmer who has, got a recipe that you can really put it, so if Hafkin was producing his serum, there were others who were saying, we know indigenous sources who are coming up with their own sort of ideas of how to combat the plague and so on. So I actually see this pandemics as, in a sense, being constituted within particular information orders. And these information orders are interacting. The state is tuned into the information order through its systems of surveillance. It is tuned into the information order of local society. So rumors that are circulating within local society make their way into the echelons of power. Likewise, what the state is doing is subject to speculation and interpretation by a whole range of groups within local society. So, and within these two, the information orders are not homogeneous. So what's very interesting is, I think pandemics open up a space in which different kinds of information orders are brought into interaction with each other. And I think if you think of it that way, then you suddenly start seeing how, this idea that these are somehow sealed off, or that you can have, some Orientalist information order that is dominated by the colonial authorities, which is sealed off from these other information orders. That kind of dissolves when you confront the evidence, which suggests that actually there's a much more interactive element to it. And all of these, I think, are also about trying to shape narratives. So if you think of today what's going on, if you think of how particular narratives are being sought to be shaped about how the disease should be perceived and interpreted, that is drawing on particular aspects of the current information order that is in contest with other narratives. So I think it's very interesting that you can kind of have a building block where you have these information orders which generate particular kinds of narratives. These narratives are internally diverse, internally contested, and they're interacting with each other. That might give us a sense of why pandemics generate so many narratives too. So I would see this not simply as a matter of space, though obviously there are elements there which are spatially inflected and which have consequences for space.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for that very detailed and relevant response. I think on that note, we will come to a conclusion of this webinar today. Pandemics, as both of you have rightfully pointed out, indeed intersect and transform not only power equations, not only people and their circumstances, but they also change the way we socialize, the way we share information, the way we the way we communicate, and most importantly, the way we as a society cope. In the end, I think we all do come out as very different people and very different ways of doing things and handling situations. Thank you, both professors, for this deep and insightful conversation. Thank you, everyone, for your active participation, for asking questions. Thank you, Professor Kidambi, for making time for being with us here today. Thank you, Darshini Madam, for your time being a part of the interaction. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. And most importantly, stay safe. We will see you again in the next conversation. The announcements will reach you shortly. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Prashant, Amita, Solly, a good bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.